Welcome to the Sirius report. The subject of today's discussion is going to be why, in effect, most of the discussion points that we see now with regards to the Ukraine war are frankly a waste of time. They're pointless, they're repetitive, and they offer no new insight. There are many reasons why channels will continue to discuss this subject matter. I think, unfortunately, one of them is they're trying to milk the Ukraine conflict for as much money as they can get out of it, as long as it lasts. So the more they repeat things, the more people watch, and therefore the more advertising revenue they make, or on other platforms, ways of generating revenue. The reality is that the West was never going to go to war directly with Russia. I think we were one of the few channels who made this point for the last 2.5 years. We've explained this many, many times. I don't want to get into too much repetition myself, but the bottom line is the United States does not want direct conflict with Russia because that will result in World War III. And the United States is in no position to go to war with Russia directly, simply because Russia is light years ahead in terms of its nuclear weapons capability, in terms of hypersonic missiles, missile defense systems. And we've seen during the course of the Ukraine war just exactly how useless US military technology is. And let's not forget either that its nuclear arsenal is decades old, is very unreliable, and they spend billions of dollars a year just making sure that these weapons don't detonate in the silos. That's how precarious the US nuclear arsenal is. The other question is, Russia ultimately could never have been defeated because it's a nuclear power. And if it got to the point where it was suffering the risk of an existential threat, it said quite publicly it would resort to using nuclear weapons. So fortunately, that's never happened. But if we had got to that point during the whole of this conflict, that's exactly what they would have done. So all this endless discussion about today, Russia lost this territory, that means it's the end of the war, Russia's losing, is just meaningless, because ultimately Russia couldn't lose. And we also said that from day one. One of the biggest problems is just this endless nonsense and repetition spouted by analysts, who then quote politicians and officials. And these politicians and officials are continually just people flapping their gums, making the right noises, saying what they have to say without any substance or meaning behind it. And we made that point far too often, where statements came out and people said, see, this is the United States wants to escalate the war and they want to get directly involved in the conflict. No, they don't. And Poland's a great example of this, who on many occasions made all these rather bombastic statements about sending military personnel into Russia. And then there was an admission from the Poles that ended up in the public domain that no, that was always a red line. We were never going to do that. No NATO country is ever going to get directly involved in Ukraine conflict. So all those discussion points were just meaningless, and therefore just a waste of time, a waste of people's effort to try and better understand what was going on in the conflict, because these fundamental points were denied. And we obviously took a lot of flack and stick for saying it, but it's proved after 2.5 years to be absolutely correct. And then, constantly quoting what the Western media has been saying for 2.5 years, which is never been accurate about anything, completely misunderstanding why Russia went to war in the first place, the kind of war Russia was fighting, the capabilities of the Russians, and the inability of the Ukrainians, and why whatever the West said would change absolutely nothing. So that again led to all this meaningless sort of analysis of statements, again, that proved to be nothing more than just words and people flapping their gums. The truth is, the Western leaders know the war's over. They've known this for a long time. They may have still harbored some delusional fantasy that Ukraine would win its counteroffensive in 2023. But when that failed, which it always was going to do so, they knew it was over and the war's long since been lost. But of course, they have to keep playing the game because their very political careers depend on it. But just because, again, they make statements means nothing. One of the other big problems we've seen consistently for far too long is people regurgitating Telegram channels who claim to have knowledge of the front line. This is not analysis. It's also pointless and meaningless because if Russia takes a village today or not today, who cares? It doesn't change the outcome of the war. It's just a way of people trying to continually justify why they should be constantly discussing the Ukraine war. It also gives this impression they understand what's going on the front line. Well, unless you're on the front line, and there might be one or two people who are near the front line, have any understanding of what's going on. The rest of it is just people regurgitating what someone else said and passing it off as their own analysis and phrasing things in a certain way that makes it sound that way. But again, it is irrelevant. And then we come on to all this thing about Zelensky's victory plan, which of course is meaningless, and everyone in the West knows it's meaningless. And these nuclear weapons threats that was blown completely out of proportion, and then very rapidly Ukrainians backtrack because of course it's meaningless. Again, it's words. I mean, how many times has Zelensky made these kind of statements, and how often have they proved to be true? Never. Absolutely never. So again, this is also just a complete waste of time. All this endless discussions about what the options are for Ukraine, and we're going to have a frozen conflict, or how are we going to end the war on our terms? All these things again are meaningless because Russia's stated its position very clearly. So again, don't waste time analyzing all those kind of statements. I mean, the other thing is, the reality is Russia can keep fighting this war for years, but Russia's never had the intention of wanting to take territory. They made it very clear they wanted to demilitarize Ukraine, and they've done that, and they've demilitarized NATO in the process. So the argument is, what really matters where we are today? What would actually be useful for people to hear and to better understand the future? Because the outcome of the war is no longer in question. It doesn't matter what happens in Kursk. Ukraine will end up leaving one way or the other. And this rate, who knows how many more casualties they'll suffer in the process. It doesn't really matter particularly what happens on a day-to-day basis in Donetsk. Occasionally, they might reach a critical town, which if the Russians liberate, might accelerate the end of the war, but it doesn't change the outcome. So what does really matter? Well, how does the war end? And what is the future for Ukraine in terms of, how much territory is Russia going to end up taking? They're interesting discussion points, but again, it's speculation. And we could speculate today and speculate tomorrow, but it doesn't actually mean anything in reality. And what's the future for NATO and the fallout of Ukraine losing the war? That's important. And for Western politicians, Western political parties, Western economies, what's going to be the fallout with Nord Stream? They're all interesting discussion points, but they're things you can mention once, maybe twice, but not repeatedly, going over and over the same analysis and trying to spin it in a slightly different way. Now, from our perspective throughout the Ukraine war, not so much in the initial couple of weeks or few weeks, but after that, we spend a very limited time on our subscription podcast discussing it, maybe half an hour a month, because that's all you need to discuss, because sometimes there are some developments that are worthy of discussion or statements that come out. But basically, they're statements which has reinforced our position from day one. And I said from day one, when Russia launched its initial strikes all across Ukraine, if it wanted to, it could have ended the war very rapidly, but it never fought a war. It was a special military operation, which are very different things. So again, from our perspective, the outcome was never in doubt for the reasons we've stated. The question is, how long does this war last? I mean, and also make the point, you can't destroy Russia economically. And that has proved to be the case as well. So I'm not telling people how to spend their time, but people often complain, I don't have enough time. There's too many channels to listen to and too many perspectives. Well, that's fine, but it's your choice if you want to listen to channels repeating themselves or multiple channels basically saying the same thing over and over again, but maybe slightly changing the perspective. But ultimately, it's a waste of time. And therefore, it's better spent assessing things that are developments that are happening somewhere else or in a completely different context, because that is a productive use of time. And frankly, that's the perspective I'm surprised most people don't seem to have. They seem to be almost addicted to listening to the same material over and over again, but they need to ask the question, what am I actually getting out of this? What's the benefit? Because there is no benefit, because just go back 12 months, 18 months ago, and all the time people have spent listening to the same things, how's it actually benefited you as an individual? How's it changed your perspective? And ultimately, what matters is when the war's over, what's going to be the fallout for Russia, for Ukraine, and for the wider West, and the broader implications. That's all that matters now. And fine for people to speculate on this, but speculate on it once. And in a broader sense, if there's any developments that are worthy of our attention or anyone else's attention, then update it, but not endlessly just repeating the same thing over and over again. And with that, I'll end this podcast. Thanks very much for listening, for all your support. Please like, share, and subscribe, and help us to grow the channel, because as ever, we always seek to inform people and most certainly not entertain people.